Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Harry Rafal, the RAF Museum's historian, and I'd like to begin by offering a very warm welcome to those of you joining us here in Lancaster, and to those of you joining us online from around the world, a global audience tonight. And it's my pleasure to be here in Lancaster for the third RAF Museum and Centre for War and Diplomacy lecture, and this is the first of these we've been able to host in person, so a real delight to be here, though as Tom will probably tell you, it's been a bit of a mission to get here. But I'm going to introduce first the co-director of the Centre for War and Diplomacy, Dr. Thomas Mills, who's going to chair today's session and introduce the speaker, Amit Gupta.
Thanks a lot. There we go. Thanks, Harry. So there we go. I'm Thomas Mills, and from the Centre for War and Diplomacy. And as Harry said, this is the first in-person event that we've been able to do since February 2020, when we had our last one. So we're delighted to be able to offer in-person events and back in that position. And after a little bit of technical adjustment, we should now have the best of both worlds insofar as having you in the room in front of us. And as Harry said, an audience from all over the world watching the event streamed. And we're delighted that the first event we've been able to do in person is in our partnership with the RAF Museum and our lecture series on air power. And it's very nice, particularly to be able to meet Harry in person for the first time in 18 months, having worked with him closely. So if you'll allow me a brief digression, I'll just tell you very quickly about the Centre for War and Diplomacy. We're a multidisciplinary research centre with members from different disciplines, including history, international relations, right through to literature, film studies, and have associate fellows at different universities around the world. We cover a broad chronological range from the medieval period through to the modern day. And we have activities across three main fronts: research, engagement, and teaching. And I'll just give you three highlights of what we've been up to recently. As part of our in-person events, we have quite a lot happening over the course of the year. The next one is a joint lecture series we have with the Lancaster Military Heritage Group, and that will feature Dame Marriott Leslie, who has vast policy experience as British Ambassador to Norway, permanent representative to NATO, and is currently advising the Scottish First Minister on what a foreign policy of an independent Scotland would look like, and that's what she's going to be talking about on the 25th of November, in the same time and place. Elizabeth Livingstone, 6 to 7:30 on the 25th of November. So please do come along to that. You'll be reminded in due course. The other thing I wanted to mention, so like everybody else, we moved online last year. One of the things we did was launch a podcast series featuring interviews, both with authors, historians, political scientists, but again, also policymakers. They range from an author of a new book on the role of women in the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s through to our most recent, which was a podcast of a live event where we interviewed Alistair Burt, Lancaster's Pro-Chancellor and a former Foreign Office and DFID Minister. So do have a look at our website, follow us on Twitter, and check out the podcast and everything else that we're up to. Finally, we're closely involved with teaching programs. We have a Master's in International Military History at Lancaster and a new Master's program in War and Diplomacy offered jointly with the Politics Department starting next year. So particularly any final year undergraduates interested in MA study, then please do come and have a chat, or again, look on our website to find out more about that. Okay, that's enough of the publicity. We're particularly delighted to be able to host Amit Gupta for our first in-person event in some time, and lucky to have him in the country. Amit is an associate professor at the US Air War College in Alabama. His writings are focused on arms production, weapons proliferation, right through South Asian and Australian security politics, conflict resolution, diaspora politics, popular culture. He tells me he's off very shortly to give a paper on James Bond. So he has truly eclectic interests, and also more recently on US-China rivalry. His articles have appeared in Orbis, Asian Survey, Security Dialogue, Roundtable, Mediterranean Quarterly, and he's the author or editor of 8 books, the most recent of which are Air Power, The Next Generation, and maritime heritage and the challenges in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. We're delighted to be able to welcome Amit this evening to talk as part of our Air Power series, talking on the challenges of future global procurement. Amit, over to you when you're ready. Do you want the slides up? Or
please.
I can do that for you if you want to
Get
started, yeah.
Okay, just to let you know, the most boring stuff you do is in your PhD, because that's what gets you a job. The most interesting stuff you do is when you've got a job, and then you go out and do the issues which I think really matter in the world. And just so you know, my proudest moment was I wrote an article on Doctor Who and cricket. And both the Sun and the Daily Mail accused me of calling Doctor Who racist. It was my proudest moment, as far as I'm concerned. But having said that, I'm a big Whovian, and anybody has a question about this, I would be happy to take it. All right. Now, what I want to talk to you about today, before I do that, one of the worst things people do at academic lectures and conferences and so on is they don't shut up. So Harry said 45 minutes tops. I've said this for 35 minutes. When this thing goes off, I will stop. It's best to discipline yourself. All right. What I want to do today is essentially talk to you about air power, but not air power in terms of technology, but can we afford it? Where do we go from here, given the changes that are taking place in the world today? So this is a more general lecture, and it's, as I see it, something that's happening around the world. Last year, I brought this book out, and then COVID happened, so not too many people bought it. But it covers about 15 countries. And the common theme running from the United States to Kenya to Indonesia was people can't afford air power anymore. And I'll get to why, but I'll get to why air power is important and where we should be headed. And here's the thing. If you go back 30 years, 40 years, what you see is you talk to an air marshal, you talk to a fighter pilot, they only think of two things. We have to do dogfights against somebody, and we have to have close air superiority. That's not air power anymore. Today, if you talk to air forces, they're dealing with illegal immigration, environmental spills. I can go down the list on this. Okay? The other thing that has happened is it's no longer the guy wearing a silk scarf sitting in the cockpit of an aircraft. It is actually unmanned vehicles. And that has both interesting dynamics for where air power is headed, but also for the ethics of air power. Because if you're not going to lose somebody, you may be more willing to use that weapon. Okay? Now, that's one part of it, but what is happening on the other side? On the other side, what is happening is, if you look around the world today, the big debate in both democracies and even non-democracies is guns versus butter. People realize very clearly, thanks to globalization, because we can look all around the world and we can figure out how people do things. For example, what happened with COVID? We all started looking at Taiwan and looked at our governments and said, why can the Taiwanese get it right and we can't? So the same thing has happened when people look across the world. They say, look at the social welfare programs of other people, look at the humanitarian programs of other people. Why aren't we headed in that direction? And the easy way to do that is always cut defense expenditure. The second thing, which for the young people in the audience, the Generation Z, the Zoomers, because you're going to be stuck with this for the next 50 years. COVID-19's long-term impact and implications, we do not have a clue. We don't know how much money we're going to have to spend. We don't know if this is a pre-existing condition now. Some people think it's like getting the flu. You get it on Monday, on Saturday, you're off to play football. It doesn't work that way. There's enough evidence to suggest that people who got it are going to have long-term issues. Okay, so let me talk about what I think is going to shape the global security environment. And it's very simply, number one, the demographic transition in both the West and in the non-West. And if you look at these numbers, they're actually quite fascinating. I'll give you a minute to sort of absorb them. And what you see there is, look across the Western world. Every country is getting older, and some of them are shrinking quite rapidly. And I would look at three countries there, the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, and then we'll talk about the strange case called Russia, okay? If you look at the Germans, they go from a population of 80 million to 74 million, and a median age of 46 to 51. If you look at Japan, it's a population demographic disaster. They go from 126 million to 107 million. And their median age goes up to 53, 54. You look at Italy, it goes from 59 million to 56 million. Their median age goes up to 51. And then, of course, you have the Russians who go from 143 to 128 million, and their median age goes up to 40, which sounds good until you look at the life expectancy of the Russian male, which is 58. Yes, it is that low. I know you guys haven't really registered that, but trust me, this is what is happening in the Western world. Populations are getting grayer, populations are shrinking. And I'll give you some idea of what this looks like in a more graphic way. These are the oldest populations in the world in the next 15 years. It's the Japanese, the Germans, Martinique, Italy, Portugal, Greece. Look at how old they all get. And I'll talk about the implications in a minute. And how do you define old? These are our beloved friends, the Germans. This is their population in 2021. And by the way, I'm incredibly lazy. I didn't make this population pyramid. I essentially took it from the US Census Bureau. But if you look at the largest bars, the largest population cohort in Germany, it is between 50 and 70. Okay. You look at that in 2035, it's between 60 and 70. It's become even older. And one more thing I want all of you to look at, just go back here for a second. Look at the bottom of the pyramid. There's less than 2 million boys in the 0 to 4 age group. There's less than 2 million girls in the 0 to 4 age group. That becomes even less in 2035. So in other words, you're going to have this huge elderly population. The younger population keeps shrinking. Let's take a look at a couple of others, then I'll talk implications for you. This is the Japanese. And again, look at where the oldest people are. The oldest people and the largest group of people in Japan are between 40 and 80. And look at how few children are being born in Japan, which is 0 to 4, which is why you see that incredible shrinkage of the Japanese population. And that's what Japan looks like in 2035. And again, look at what happens to the babies in Japan. They aren't being born. It keeps shrinking and shrinking. And you have this large collection of old people. And in Japan, as you know, one of the scandals they had was people were taking their elderly relatives and freeze drying them and claiming their social security benefits until the Japanese government cracked down on that. So some of the upper numbers might be a bit skewed. But here's the thing. If your populations are so old, can you, A, go to war? Because think of it this way. If you're 65 years old, can you lug a 60-pound backpack and climb up a hill? And how many times are you going to have to stop because your prostrate's giving you problems? That is not a fun thing to do. Second thing in it is, where are they going to spend their money? And Japan's a really interesting case here for all of you to look at. The Japanese now are spending a lot of money on robotics because they've realized with an elderly population, you're going to need robots in the workforce. But for an elderly population, robots provide companionship, robots provide help. When you guys go home tonight, Google Aibo, that's spelled A-I-B-O. That's the Japanese robot dog built by Sony. And it can do, I think, about 2,000 commands. All the elderly people are buying them. And when Aibo breaks down, they take Aibo to the toy repair or to the toy doctor, because with 3 years of Aibo, you've built up a narrative around Aibo. You have your stories you've told Aibo. You can't just go to the Sony store and pick up a new one. That's the future of Japan. And we can talk about the military implications in a minute. And this is Russia. I'll give you a second to take a look at that population pyramid. What strikes you as being interesting in that one? This is question to audience.
Men are dying quicker than the women.
The men are dying much quicker than the women. Remember what I said? Life expectancy is 58. That's the reason why. And look at the birth rates. They're not that high either. Take this to 2035. Not only is the largest group of Russians over 50, which means they're useless for fighting, they're going to need a lot of healthcare, but look at the huge demographic distortion. Okay? And this is you. You actually look pretty good. You're going to get old, but you'll still have a population. And that's that. Now, if this is what's happening in the West, what's happening in the non-Western world? I'll add China to this before I get to the non-Western world. One of the big things academics talk about, and I've now disassociated myself from academia, is the Chinese are going to get old before they get rich. The Chinese won't have people to fight. The Chinese won't have people to do industrial innovation, et cetera, et cetera. You've all read that in your courses. Everybody who writes that is wrong, and I'll show you why. This is the Chinese population pyramid in 2035. Look at how many Chinese there are between the ages of 0 to 39. I did a rough and ready count. It was about 350 million. So 350 million is more than the population of the United States. Do you need more than 350 million people to fight, to do industrial innovation, to give you the next Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and your hero, Mark Zuckerberg? You know, I can go down the list on this. They have enough. So don't get into this talk about the Chinese are aging, et cetera, et cetera. With 350 million people, they have enormous capacity. And keep this in mind. What are the Chinese putting their money in? 5G. Because what does 5G allow you to do? Robotics. So there is a long-term plan for the Chinese. But let's look at the non-Western world, and then we'll talk security for a minute, and then I'll get to air power. This is the demographic transition in the non-Western world. And there's two that I would look at with some interest. One is Afghanistan, and the other one is the bottom of the list, Pakistan. And if you look at Afghanistan, Afghanistan's population keeps growing. It goes from 32 million to close to 56 million. But look at the median age. It goes from 17 and a half, which is around your age group, to close to 30. And this is why you can't win a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, because there's an endless supply of warriors. And then go look at Pakistan, which is next door. And it's the same story. Pakistan goes from 188 million, almost doubles to 309 million. But look at the median age again, goes from 22 and a half to 30. Again, what does this say about national security? And these are the youngest populations in the world, which as Europeans, you should be are you still Europeans or are you in some other status now? I can never figure out what has happened. Young people, yes or no? Don't know. The young lady with the black mask.
I'm Greek, so technically I am European.
Oh, you're Greek, you're European. Yes, you are definitely European. You have no answer. You're undecided. You're that in every survey, I strongly oppose, I strongly support, 8% undecided. You're in that category. Got it. All right. What is the interesting thing about this? When you look at this list of the youngest countries in the world, they're all in Africa. Exactly. They're all in Africa. They're all relatively poor. Where do these people go? That becomes the question. And just to belabor the point, that is Niger's population. This is the youngest country in the world, by the way. Take a look at that. The median age of Niger is 15. It goes up to, I think, 17 or 18 at some point of time. Look at how young the population is. If you are a government bureaucrat in Niger, you are an incredibly happy person because you're not paying social security, pensions, etc. That is there. And that's Niger in 2035. All right, what are the security implications? Let me sum them up. The West gets older, grayer, has to spend more on social welfare, whether you like it or not. Elderly people, unlike you, go out and vote. So they corner a portion of the resources. 2, there is the issue of who are you going to get to fight? And 3, where are the major security challenges going to come from? Talk to the Greeks, talk to the Italians, talk to the Spanish. What is their number one concern now? It's illegal immigration. It's not going and fighting the Russians in the Baltics. It's illegal immigration. And which then brings me to, if this is the security scenario, add to this COVID, what do you do about air power? Now, here's the deal. Air power is no longer, as I said at the beginning, something that you see in the old movies where Tom Cruise is flying an aircraft and shooting down Libyans or some unnamed Middle Eastern nation. It's a bunch of things which we never really thought of. So the Italian Air Force now tells me our number one concern is illegal migration, because it comes across the Mediterranean. They have to figure out how to stop it. If you talk to the Norwegian Air Force, they're worried about oil spills, because they say our oil spills will go to Germany and the Germans will sue us. So how do we monitor that? They're less worried about the Russians, by the way. The third thing, which is really interesting, in a lot of countries, people don't want to fight, but they want to participate in a military operation. And the best example of this is Australia. I know you're all thrilled with AUKUS. I'm not. I think, to use the words of the Chinese, it's a paper tiger in some ways. But what I think is interesting is the Australians have the money, but they also have a serious commitment to supporting Western efforts. And what they said back about 10 years ago was, we're going to buy the C-17, which is this huge tanker in which you can carry all sorts of things, transport, sorry. And they wanted 4. Their politicians saw how good they were for operations, and they actually gave them 8. And for those of you who study air forces, no air force ever can say we asked for 4 planes and we got 8. It's always the reverse. But the Australians did this because they said with C-17s, we can participate in American operations, Japanese operations, be seen all around the world, and we can be a major player. So this is what they're talking about. The other one is the rise of unmanned vehicles. And here's what's interesting about them. They're cheap. Some of them are off the shelf, and I'll get to that in a second. And using them is really not only cost effective, but one goes down, so you lost a piece of machinery. Pilot goes down, it's on CNN and BBC. It's a different game. So using them becomes a lot easier. And I'll give you the example of the 2 examples. One is the Houthis in Yemen, and the other is Azerbaijan. The Houthis in Yemen bought off-the-shelf drones, and they used them to attack Saudi oil facilities. The Saudis have some of the best air defenses in the world. They couldn't stop the drones. And these cheap drones go in, blow up a few oil rigs, and all of a sudden, price of oil starts going up, and the Saudis are worried. What do we do? The Azerbaijanis learned this. They bought Turkish drones, and they took out Armenian artillery in the last war. Again, the Turkish drones were off the shelf. You could buy the engine somewhere, you could buy the wings somewhere, put it together. It was like going on Amazon, literally. And this is where warfare is headed, because a lot of countries look at this and say, why spend $100 million on a Eurofighter when you could buy something for $5 million, which gives you a bigger bang for the buck? And I should add one more thing on this. We now are in a gray area on air power. Air power used to be Royal Air Force, French Air Force, US Air Force, People's Liberation Army Air Force. Now it's all kinds of people. One of the most effective air forces in the world in the last 10 to 15 years has been the Central Intelligence Agency, using them for surveillance and for taking out terrorists. And I'll give you the story of how the Central Intelligence Agency did it. Back when Bosnia was going on, the Central Intelligence Agency said, we need a drone because Bosnia is rugged territory, lots of cloud cover. We need something which can fly low and is cheap. So they went to the Pentagon and said, how much? And the Pentagon put it through its acquisitions process and said, 5 to 10 years, $500 million to $1 billion. And the director of the CIA said, I don't have that money and I don't have the time. Somebody told him there was an Israeli American whose drone company had failed. So he went to him and said, can you do this? He said, sure. 3 to 4 million, 9 to 12 months. For you, 3.5 million. And that's the story of the CIA drone program. Within a year, they were flying in Bosnia. Within a year, they were making a marked difference in how that war was being surveilled and covered. And you've all seen what drones have done in other parts of the world with anti-terrorist operations. Now, let me get back to the point, though. I don't think the West is going to find it that easy to build new fighter aircraft, new airplanes, which are increasingly technologically sophisticated, because they're way too expensive, given the competing demands of healthcare and social welfare. And the iron rule on this is, when a government faces a choice between guns and butter, butter always wins. So where can we go with this? Let me say that. And I'll give you some ideas from what's happening around the world. People are not buying as much as they used to. The Indians wanted to manufacture 116 of them at home, the Rafales. They ended up buying only 36 off the shelf from the French. And the reason was, when they looked at what it would cost to build the plane, it was going to be 3 times as expensive than importing it from Dassault in France. So they shrunk it. The Argentinian saga is a very sad saga. They've gone around the world trying to buy airplanes, and they've run into 2 problems. Problem number 1 is most aircraft are too expensive for the Argentinians. Problem number 2 is, there's this pesky country called Britain, which tells them, well, our technology is in the Korean fighter aircraft, so sorry, we can't give it to you. Not until you get this Malvinas, Falklands thing sorted out. So the Argentinians don't know what to do. And they're looking for second-hand aircraft. They're too expensive. First-hand aircraft, nobody wants to sell them. Where do you go? And the people who want to sell them, the Argentinians can't afford them. So now they're talking to the Chinese, the Russians, you name it. And my favorite country in Latin America is Uruguay. For a whole bunch of reasons. 1, they punch above their weight in football. 2, they are an incredibly socially advanced nation. And 3, they had a Marxist-Leninist called Pepe Mujica as their president. And if you're interested, you should look up Pepe's life history. He started life as a terrorist, but was reconciled with the Uruguayan nation and then becomes their president. The Uruguayans went to their government and said, can we please have a radar on one of our planes? That's all we ask. And radars, as you all know, has been around since World War II. But this is the problem with buying stuff now. And there's very few countries in the world who have the money. I put up the Australians. They are the one country they can buy nuclear submarines, F-35s, you name it. They are actually rich enough to do it. And the one thing I like about the Aussies is you ask them this question: are you going to buy 100 aircraft? They say, yes, we will. Well, everybody else said, we claimed 100, but we'll actually buy 60. The Australians are not like that. They make very hard policy choices and they stick with them. So they're quite good at that. Now, if you take out the Australians, who's going to buy all this stuff? And I'll get to what I think is happening, and then I'll end with the United States. Look, I think you need to bring about a range of airplanes in the West that can compete with the Chinese and the Russians. And you don't have that right now. So back in the Cold War, you had planes like the F-5 and the MiG-21. They were cheap, they were affordable. The Russians built them like they were building, transistor radios, and they sold them all over the world. There's no such aircraft like that today. The only one that's there is the Chinese JF-17, and that goes at about somewhere around $30 million. So Uruguay can't buy it. Argentina may be able to buy it. And it's not that great an airplane. The West does not have an export drone. The politically correct word for it is unarmed combat aerial vehicle. Yeah. Yet this is the thing which most of America's allies, Britain's allies, Europe's allies need. Because think about it this way, if you are Brazil, you're not really worried about the Argentinians invading, but you are worried about the degradation of the Amazon. And you can't use a fighter jet to surveil the Amazon. You can use a drone. But where do they buy this stuff? And the answer is the West is not interested in an appropriate fighter, the West an affordable fighter. It's not building the export drone right now. Add to this one more thing. Look at countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan. They both wanted fast jets. They moved instead to propeller-driven planes because they were fighting insurgencies. You need more of those in the world. And then, of course, you have the C-17, which is, I've written a lot on this. It's this huge transport aircraft. The US shut down the production line. And the Kuwaitis wanted more, the Australians wanted more, the Indians wanted more, a bunch of countries wanted more. And I lead the one-man struggle to say, give the production line to somebody else, because you'll find 50 people who want to buy the airplane. So add this up, this is where I think air power goes. I'll end with the United States, because this is really interesting. Remember, best air force in the world, most powerful air force in the world, richest air force in the world, and it actually publishes its budgets. The Chinese don't. So we're not quite clear what the Chinese have in terms of actual resources. There are claims. But what's interesting here is what Charles Quinton Brown Jr., the chief of the US Air Force, said. He said, look, we've bought this new fancy airplane called the F-35. It's great, but I don't drive a Ferrari to work every day. It's hugely expensive to fly, maintain, etc. So we need something which is cheaper. And what he's talked about, for those of you who are Air Force tech junkies, is something which is a 4.5 generation plus fighter to minus 5th generation fighter. He says, this is where we need to go. It is more affordable. Now, let me end with this. What do I think can happen? The US is building a supersonic trainer aircraft called the T-7 Red Hawk. That could become the affordable fighter in the United States. In Britain, you had a great export fighter called the Hawk. The Hawk's an old plane now. It first flew in 1972, correct me if I'm wrong. But a great plane. You need something new. And I don't mean the Tempest, because I'm not sure even you can afford that. when it comes about. You need an export drone, as I pointed out. David Goldfein, the last chief of the US Air Force, suggested we have light tactical attack aircraft, which countries like Nigeria, Afghanistan, you name it, can use when you have insurgencies and so on. Hypersonics, I can get into that if you like. But the other thing, the future is going to be, think about it this way. All of European aircraft manufacturing went from independent companies in countries like Britain and France to these big European collaborations. I think you're going to have North-South collaboration now. The French and the Germans are building a 6th-generation fighter, and there's a lot of nationalism involved in it. I would love to see what the numbers are. But the Koreans, the Indians, the Brazilians, and the UAE, by the way, are all interested in collaborating in these kinds of programs. So if you're building Tempest, you need a foreign partner. If you're building whatever they call it FCAS, I think, right? The French one, the Franco-German one. Do you guys know what the acronym is? It's something like that. Anyway, they're going to need an independent partner. I think the key to this is globalization. And I'll end with this. Butter is going to win. So we need to start making very smart choices about defense. Thank you. And you'll be pleased to know I'm in 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Amit. It's fascinating. So we have time for questions. I'll take some from the room. I shall also have a look and see if we have any from our online audience as well. Apologies to those online for the teething problems in getting the slides up, and you'll be able to whiz back and see those that you missed, and I can assure you Harry was working very hard to get them there for you. So over to you for questions. I'll just move this one. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
At the start, when you were talking about all the demographics, when you were talking about the West becoming the population is becoming older, are you suggesting that because we're going to be sacrificing defence budgets for social welfare budgets, that's going to reduce the likelihood of conflict or the will to gain? Or are you suggesting that the nature of that conflict is just going to be, the nature of the technology is going to be different? So, what sort of the implication of what you're suggesting?
I think all of the above. I think all of the above in the sense, reduced budgets, expeditionary work, let's go deep into Africa, let's go into Asia, into the South China Sea, less likely. I think you'll see a Europe which comes together far more and makes very interesting choices. I was telling Sam about this. The Germans now have a unified military command with the Czechs and the Dutch, two countries which they ran over very quickly in World War II. So those memories are long gone. But the Dutch got rid of their armored regiment. They now lease German Leopard tanks and are part of the German Unified Command. The Czechs have put in their infantry. They want to bring the Finns in. Probably they'll bring in the other Scandinavians. Now you put 7, 8 countries together, you have economies of scale, so on. So I think that's there. There's the other side to this. There's a Canadian political scientist, Christian Leprecht, at the Canadian Royal Military College, who says, look, as Canadians, we are more than willing to fight for the defense of our homeland. It's a lot more difficult to send us out 3,000 miles to go and fight there. And that is the sense I get around the West. So I think everything you just said is going to come true, which is positive as far as I'm concerned. Yes, Sam?
Are you suggesting that in the West we move back towards kind of the old style of industrial companies, private companies developing aircraft for kind of niche, I suppose, low-end, budget-end kind of roles? So the idea of having newly produced advanced propeller aircraft that are essentially brand new but use a cheaper old technology.
There's two parts to that. I think, one, it's required, but two, nobody's going to buy it from Britain unless the RAF buys a chunk of them. Because the argument always made is, if your government doesn't think it's a good plane, it can't be a good plane, which is completely incorrect. The US has built export aircraft in the past. There was one called the F-20 Tiger Shark, which never sold because the United States Air Force said, we're already buying the F-16. How many variations of the F-16 do you want? So I think if you want to do it, both as from a sales perspective and from a diplomacy, foreign policy, alliance building perspective, there has to be some traction within air forces to buy these kinds of planes. Now, it's interesting what's happening is Southern Command in the United States is holding a competition to get these kinds of aircraft because they've realized in Latin America, you'll never use an F-35. It's overkill. But a slow propeller aircraft which can do counterinsurgency, surveil drug regions is valuable. So they're talking about, I think, buying somewhere between 60 to 75. But they buy 60 to 75, you get the economies of scale to sell it to everybody else. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hello. Could you talk a bit about the China thing? Because I find this fascinating. We've got Lancaster University here is dependent
Yes.
on Chinese students coming and spending £30,000 on their fees, and it's made a good business of having thousands of Chinese people here. Every time HMS Queen Elizabeth sails around China, the number of Chinese students coming to Lancaster University goes down. And how does that interplay with the economic interests of the United Kingdom and the psychological issues the United States have of not being a world power anymore because of the rise of China? How do you reconcile those two tendencies?
Two different questions, but both of them, I think, are going to get played out over the next 10 to 15 years. To take the first one, here's the thing. If you look at the US-Soviet rivalry, or the East-West rivalry from the Cold War, it took till the Cuban Missile Crisis to get some degree of certainty, to get some degree of predictability in the relationship. And I think the problem right now is we are struggling to figure out what the Chinese want, and the Chinese are struggling to figure out what the West wants. That's one. Two, on the Chinese, I mean, you're making the point about Chinese students, and that's everywhere, by the way. The Australians are heavily dependent on Chinese students and Chinese tourism. That's the other one. But if you look at China's main trading partners now, and I have the slides, if you like, I can show you the numbers, you'll be fascinated. China's largest trading partner now is ASEAN. China's second largest trading partner is the EU, without you. You've complicated data building now for lots of people around the world, sadly. But it's ASEAN because everybody trades with their neighbors. And secondly, it's the EU. Thirdly, it's the United States. Fourth, it's Japan. And I've always made this argument. The West is still talking global strike. Can I fire a cruise missile from somewhere and make it hit Beijing? The Chinese are talking globalization. And they have ambition, they have vision, they have resources. Keep this in mind. The Chinese want to spend $1 trillion on the Belt and Road. And as they always point out, $1 trillion is just the infrastructure. I mean, after that, you know, as Mark Knopfler said, first come the churches, then come the schools, then come the lawyers, then come the rules. And since none of you know who Mark Knopfler is, it's a wasted analogy. But does somebody know who Mark Knopfler is? Thank you. Yes, it's Dire Straits, it's Telegraph Road. Yes. So the point is they're saying it could go up to 8 trillion. And if you are the West, if you want to compete with the Chinese, you have to give people an alternative for a better future. And where is the Western Belt and Road? Now, Joe Biden's come up with this idea that we will build, you know, we'll have a build back better kind of thing for the rest of the world. The problem is they're talking a public-private partnership. And not too many private companies want to go and invest in the Congo or Paraguay or Vietnam or so on. They're looking for a certain bet. And I'll bring up the Greek one, which is really important. Remember what I said, Chinese have ambition, vision, resources, and they have lots of population. So don't, next time somebody says that in class, tell them you're wrong. So and I saw the data. But here's the thing, what the Greeks did with, the Chinese did. The Greeks go bankrupt. They sell the port of Piraeus to the Chinese, a controlling interest, I think. And the Chinese say, we will make this port bigger than Rotterdam. And if you've ever been to Rotterdam and seen the flow of industrial goods that comes out of there, from Northern Europe, that is a truly bold statement, but they will do it. They want to set up 5G around the world. And to answer your question, I think the challenge from China is not the military one, because I'll give you one answer on that. The Chinese aren't looking to fight Britain in the North Atlantic. That's a long way from the South China Sea. What they want to do is what they call a high technology war in local conditions. So when you send the QE2, or not the QE2, the Queen Elizabeth to the South China Sea, can you sustain operations there? No, it's too expensive. And it'll probably be blown out of the water with all the hypersonic missiles and stuff that the Chinese are putting into play now. So they are looking at this very differently, I think. And we need to come up, and I'll add one more thing to what you just asked. And I'm sorry, this is now becoming me on the giving you a sermon in some sense. I'm not religious, I'm a true socialist. On vaccines, the West needs to challenge and provide an alternative, better future to the rest of the world on COVID-19. Because right now the Chinese and the Russians with Sputnik 5 are going around the world and giving it to people and cutting all kinds of deals. I think it's very easy to ramp up vaccine production and send it around the world, and send it around the world free. Just remember this, and most of you are too young to know this. Smallpox used to kill people around the world. The last recorded case of smallpox was in Bangladesh in 1976, because the World Health Organization, essentially driven by the Western nations, sent the vaccine everywhere. And so I think it's twofold. One, come up with something which looks better than BRI. And two, start giving the booster to as many people as you can.
I'm going to take one question from the
Sure.
online, and then we'll come back to in the audience. So we have a question from Roger King, and he says that terrorism is a big threat. More money seems to be spent on surveillance and intelligence gathering aircraft. The platforms are cheaper, but with high-tech sensors. Do you have any comments on that?
Oh, he's absolutely right. I mean, for Europe today, what are your real challenges? Does anybody here really think the Russians are coming across the Fulda Gap into Germany? Show of hands, please. And especially given the demographics I just showed you. Because with 50-year-olds, it's a bit hard to wage conflict. Trust me on this one. But your main problem is terrorism. Think of the spate of terrorism you've had in the last 5 years in all kinds of countries in Europe. And for that, you need exactly what Roger King is talking about. So yes, absolutely. That's...
Okay. Did you have a question at the front? Yep. Yeah, go ahead, please.
If that's okay.
Sorry?
I had a couple of questions. If that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
If you don't have time, that's fine.
Fire away. We'll see how we go.
Of like the 6th generation fighter jets that like Mitsubishi, I think, from Japan.
Yeah.
There's all of those. Which do you think are the most promising? Second question, Rafale's or Eurofighter Typhoons, which one is better in your opinion? And third, the Patriot missile system or the Russian S-800?
S-400.
S-400.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you compare those two for me? And last question is, how far behind China is the US and the rest of the world with hypersonics?
Okay, very quickly. I am not a big fan of technology, sixth generation, whatever, because I'm going to tell you the bitter truth on warfare. And you saw this in Afghanistan, okay? The US and NATO had the best technology in the world. What did your average Taliban fighter have? He had an AK-47 and he wore a loose kurta pajama and flip-flops, sandals. Who's running Afghanistan right now? And this is the thing. You can build all the sixth generation stuff you like, but decisive military conflicts today require boots on the ground. And you should always ask your citizenry, are you willing to see people die? And the answer on that in most countries in the world today is no. Now, if you ask me, I don't think there's much of a difference between a Rafale and which one did you say, the Eurofighter? No, they're both good, capable airplanes. On sixth generation, we don't know. On the Chinese, I'll say this. The Chinese have trouble with their engines.
If I may,
Please.
I was asking about the Eurofighter Typhoon and Rafale because obviously, like, especially now, you see the tension between France and the UK.
Yeah.
So on one side, you've got the Eurofighter Typhoon. I know that's the UK collaboration with other countries, but you essentially got them to, say, I'm from Bangladesh, right? And they're looking to procure supply jets right now. And I believe they're looking at, I don't know how much or they actually have the money to procure them, but they're looking at the Eurofighter Typhoon and the Rafale. So clearly they won't compete to export them. And yes, so that's why I was asking, like, which one do you think is better?
Okay.
Politics aside.
I'll give you a different answer, which is Bangladesh specific. Bangladesh has made huge progress in the last 10 years because it brought in really good social policies. It got in a pretty good economic policy. It's the textile capital of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And your government now feels in 20 years you'll be a developed nation. Right, that's the goal. Now, whether they get there or not, different story, but it's a positive path as I see it. The Bangladesh Air Force, a Eurofighter, Rafale, nothing's going to come in under 100 million. And you need to ask yourself, how many of these can you afford? And who exactly are you flying this against?
Myanmar, India.
Myanmar, India. Yeah. Well, the Indians love Sheikh Hasina. And Myanmar, you don't need the Rafale. It's like fighting Luxembourg, if I may put it that way.
I think, like, you see the Rohingya crisis, right? All the million refugees and then pressure on the country, which is already overpopulated. So then, like, essentially, I think Bangladesh doesn't want to be bullied by Myanmar, which I believe personally is the biggest threat to Bangladesh right now. So they want to, like, be able to be strong in the face of Myanmar, put more pressure on to repatriate.
I'll give you a one-sentence answer. You can't use fighter jets to stop refugees. Trust me. It doesn't work. You can't build walls to stop refugees. Refugees just come across borders, right? So you should keep that in mind. And I think they may be looking at all those airplanes. What they buy is going to be very different. It's too expensive. You're right.
I'm going to take another one from online, and then we'll come to a couple at the back. So this is from Paul Harrison for the more global approach. Do you see a future for aircraft carriers, or should air power be limited in its global reach?
I'm a huge fan of submarines. They're cheaper, they're stealthier, they can blow things up very effectively. Aircraft carriers are huge, and unless you can defend an aircraft carrier, it's a sitting duck. Go and look at a US carrier battle group. Okay? It's not just the aircraft carrier. It's the destroyers. It's the people who defend it. It's the submarines that go with it. It's an enormously expensive process. So to answer your question, I'm all for submarine forces. They're a whole lot cheaper. They're very difficult to track. There is a bureaucratic politics problem with submarines. If the Royal Navy takes Boris Johnson and says, Mr. Prime Minister, here's the Queen Elizabeth, and they get F-35s to take off it. It's a beautiful visual, right? Anybody appreciates that. What do you say with a submarine, Mr. Prime Minister? If you look deep in the English Channel, there somewhere, there is HMS Trafalgar or whatever you've got going there right now. It doesn't work. And one of the great heroes of submarine forces was a guy called Hyman Rickover, who built America's nuclear submarine force. And he said the budgets of submarines to aircraft carriers was the chicken horse burger, where the submarine force got the chicken and the aircraft carrier force got the horse in the burger. But in real terms, I'll say this. I think unless you can really afford the kind of defensive capabilities the US Navy has, it is extremely expensive and limited results out of it. I'll just give you the one idea of what the Chinese say about the aircraft carrier. It's, we're not going to use it against the Americans, we use it against the Vietnamese. Right? So you pick your enemy and you do so. But you can't afford to do that in modern day conflict. So I would agree with you that I think the day of the aircraft carrier has passed. It makes a lot more sense to be thinking in terms of hypersonic missiles and some of the other things that people are doing. I mean, one of the really smart things that's coming out with 6th generation is going to be the fighter jet with the UAV, with the drone that the pilot is taking along with him. And think of what you can do. And I'll just say one more techie thing, because I know this is where everybody's eyes glaze over. In the Cold War, one of the huge changes that worked in NATO's favor was the development of cruise missiles. And the sexy thing on the cruise missile was not the cruise missile, it was the engine, which was about that big. So, you know, it's about the size of a lawnmower engine, if you want to put it that way. But that thing could provide thrust. So I'm not an aircraft carrier fan. I think it's a different concept. And if you want to go in that direction, buy a long-range bomber like the United States Air Force. But the United States Air Force's budget is more than anybody else on the planet. So they can afford it. Most countries can't.
Thank you.
Do
I think
people
we
have
have one right at the back. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, go ahead.
What do you sort of see the role of a unmanned combative aircraft being? If that makes sense.
Surveillance, attack, and you know, there's a really good bunch of work being done now on the ethics of unmanned aircraft and robotics. Because as we build more and more robots to do killing, the Chinese, by the way, go online and type in Chinese military robot dog. They're using them in difficult terrain now. But if everything is going to be unmanned, using it becomes a lot easier. So that ethical question, again, is something which I think publics have to debate and decide upon. They're very efficient, they're cheaper, and if you're not going for something which is incredibly high-tech and fancy, you can still get the job done. I keep going back to Azerbaijan and the Houthis. Yes, sir.
I meant more autonomous rather than direct control.
Sorry, I can't hear.
More autonomous rather than direct control for literally.
Oh, more autonomous. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. It's the next technological leap. But again, it boils down to what are the ethics going to be? Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that most air forces in the world are losing the ability to engage long-termly in an intense full-scale warfare? And even the air forces of superpowers like China and America don't have the ability to engage in a full-scale intense combat. With the current way people are building up their Air Force, like a limited number of 6th generation fighters with still quite a large number of 5th generation fighters like J-16 and the F-15EX.
I think you're right. I think it's very difficult to do a long-term, highly intensive war, given the huge costs involved. And look, I would also say this to you. On a US-China conflict, the real problem is not that the Americans and the Chinese start shooting at each other. The real problem is, what are the long-term global consequences? Because the level of interdependence between the two is so huge now. You know, I'll just give you a personal note. I need a new refrigerator. I'm buying a new carbon fiber bicycle because I've decided to get physically fit again. And I need new window panes for my house. All three are on hold because the supply chain in China is backlogged, right? So what is happening in the United States is people who were talking about moving supply chains are going back to China. This kind of interdependency was not there in the Cold War. We didn't buy anything from the Russians. What could you buy from the Russians? Vodka, caviar, and we're still buying that. But there's nothing coming out from Russia today that the rest of the world really wants to look at, except for hackers. That's a different story. You had a question, sir.
Yes, so you were putting a lot of emphasis on air power. So I was wondering what's going to happen to like the other dimensions of warfare. What's going to happen to naval power? What's going to happen to land power? Are you going to adapt the drones, or are you just going to disappear?
Oh, I think they're all going to use drones, right? I think it's going to be harder and harder to use land power because sending troops to die is going to be more and more difficult because we live in such a media-intensive world. And I'll add one thing to this. Look, if you talk to doctors, you should talk to British doctors who went to Afghanistan and so on. They did a remarkable job in patching up people and bringing them home. But the problem is, and keep this in mind, how old are you? 18. Perfect age to send to fight and die for the country. Yes. It's sad. You know, you are the flowers of the next generation. They should be sending people my age, but they don't. We'd be an embarrassment. What can I say? Here's the thing. You go to war today and, you know, pick your country and your arm gets blown off or your leg gets blown off. Those doctors are so good, they will triage you and bring you back to Britain. But here's what I want you to understand, because it's all about money in the end. If we are spending £2 on you at 18, we'll be spending £3 at 25, we'll be spending £6 at 40, we'll be spending £12 at 60. And 50,000 people came back as wounded warriors from Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, and I'm not even counting PTSD because we don't know what those numbers are. So land warfare, believe me, the next one, you're going to see public stand up and say, why? How many people do we send? How long do we stay there? What is the casualty threshold? You know, these are important things. And again, you can debate this with your friends. How many young British women and men are you willing to lose in a conflict in a third country? I don't mean in the defense of Britain. That you'll all do. But pick a state, you know, to go and defend Latvia. How many people are you willing to lose? And that's a hard question to answer. That's a very hard question to answer. So I think land forces, you can use them technologically. The West technology is good. But if you want a permanent solution to a problem, you have to sit there for 50 years, right? And nobody has the time. If any of you get the chance, read a book by David Halberstam called The Best and the Brightest, which is on the United States and Vietnam in the 1960s. And Halberstam was a New York Times reporter. He went to Vietnam and asked the French, who was still there, how long would it take the United States to do nation building in Vietnam? I'm doing this Freudian thing today. I keep going back to Afghanistan. I apologize. The French said 70 to 100 years. And I remember reading that in college and laughing, saying 70 to 100 years? The French just don't understand what they're talking about. But what have you learned from Afghanistan today? 20 years was not enough. It probably would have been 70 to 100 years, but nobody wanted to sit there. So I think that's land power. I think naval power is hugely important. I think naval power has to be configured to the fact that you're going to be fighting people with missiles. So you need different kinds of ships, you need different kinds of submarines, and so on. And on the European context, I'll just say one thing. The richest country in Europe after Switzerland is Germany. The Germans don't want aircraft carriers, the Germans don't want Leopard tanks, the Germans don't want nuclear weapons. The Germans want wind energy. And ask yourself what shift is happening there. You see what I'm saying? I really don't look at air power or sea power or naval land power as technology. Look at it as the cumulative will of a society. And where do you as a society want to go? I mean, can I have a show of hands? How many of you were in favor of sitting in Afghanistan for another 50 years? Oh, one. I'm so proud of you.
Because I'm Lebanese and I was afraid of the sequences,
Okay.
the consequences.
Okay. We have 1 out of 25 people. The rest of you didn't think it was a good idea. Well, if you're not willing to sit there for 50 years, what's going to happen? And that's land power.
I suppose I can just follow up on that briefly.
Yeah.
I understand all the arguments make sense about the will and
Yeah.
willingness of countries to do that, but then isn't there something unique that land power provides, be it the kind of attempts at hearts and
Yeah.
minds, which
Yeah.
thinking of Vietnam is not always successful, but or simply holding territory? I mean, can air power, can naval power do that in a way that land forces, that armies can?
You have to sit somewhere for 60, 70 years. Let me put it this way, Tom. And all of you, I mean, anybody under 25 will not get this. Anybody over 40 will get this. Okay. I have a friend, Ingrid, who we traveled to Iceland, or Island as they call it, to see Ea Fjalla Jökull. And the reason I bring up this story is I'm the only person who can pronounce that long Icelandic name. And the driver who took us there kept on about the Germans did this and the Germans did that. And she's German and she got very embarrassed. And I asked her, I said, does this embarrass you when people talk about what the Germans did in World War II? And she said, yes, of course it does, but we deserved it. Okay. Then my next question, follow-up, was, when did you learn about concentration camps? And what she said was, at 14, they teach it to us in school. Because by 14, you've reached a level of maturity that you can actually understand this. At 6, it's pointless. And at 16, they take them to their first concentration camp. And then Ingrid said, and that's when you realize that everything your grandfather told you about the war was bullshit. Okay. And Ingrid's about 45, 46 now. So it's taken 3 generations in Germany to come to this realization that we own what happened in World War II. And you look at the young Germans you guys meet, it's not the Germany of 1935 or even the Germany of 1975. It's such a different Germany. But that happened why? Because NATO, American forces sitting in Germany, and they're still there today, that's nation building. And to answer your question, Tom, how often are we willing to do that?
Okay, Tom, and then, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Perhaps not sophisticated for some people's questions, but going back to the China thing, you mentioned that China is all right with its demographics because it's got over, say, 300 million young people, but surely I would have thought it was the relative numbers of young people to the elderly population rather than, in absolute terms, it is quite large, it's larger than the US population, but also in terms of, say, social security, it's still going to be a hefty burden compared to before.
Yeah, oh, well, you're right. They're going to spend a lot more on social security. And they should spend a lot more on social security. Okay, so that's one. But the second thing is, what I'm trying to say is, don't think of the Chinese as, well, they're getting old, so they're not going to be a threat. They're not going to be an economy and all this stuff. That is hugely exaggerated. And just see the amount of money they're putting into robotics. Okay? And that is the future. It's, if you had gone to a car plant in Britain in the 1960s, you would have seen maybe 10,000 workers per shift. Today, you go there, there's 1,000 workers per shift, maybe. And it'll keep shrinking because now robots make cars and robots talk to robots. So that's where I think the Chinese are headed. What I'm trying to say is, yes, they will have to spend more on their social problems. Yes, they should spend more on their social problems, but do not think that this makes them weaker. That's it.
I'm going to take one more
Sure.
offline as we're
Sure.
getting through a few. This takes us into another domain. Do you think the new front of cyber warfare will interact? How do you think the new front of cyber warfare will interact with the aerospace grey zone?
Oh. Okay, that one, I lack the technological understanding to show you the link between cyber and aerospace. I honestly can't do that, so I'm not going to make a fool of myself. But cyber is so cheap to do. And I mean, the impact of cyber now, I used to sit there saying this was exaggerated until you saw what happened in the United States last year, where people started hacking into all kinds of systems. And the thing is, we're not sure who's hacking. Russians, North Koreans, Iranians, Pakistanis, you name it. This one is a free-for-all. So cyber is definitely the threat of the future. If you want to start a war against somebody, shut off their water supply for 10 days. See how that goes. So is there another one there that you want me to take?
There's one on, back to Britain, if we could take that one. It's whether the 2 new British aircraft are limited by not having air-to-air refueling capabilities to extend strike ranges.
Where are you going to go? Seriously.
Not the Falklands.
The Falklands, yes, it is. Always remember the great story of the Falklands. The Conservative defense minister was asked after the strike on Port Stanley. You know this as a military historian. And the Labour guy stood up and said, so how much damage was done to Port Stanley with that Vulcan raid, which was really impressive? And the Conservative defense minister stands up and says, not much, and sat down. That was the answer there. I mean, where are you going that you need refueling beyond Europe? Are you really going to do Falklands too? Well, actually, the correct question to ask is, will the Argentinians do Falklands too? So the answer is no. I'm not sure where you're going to go with refueling. I mean, you may need it in Europe, and that makes complete sense. But then, again, within NATO, you can talk to people, and some people can make that for you. That would be my argument. I'm sorry, I'm not very militaristic, am I? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I ask a question about, you talked a little bit about China and the US, about Taiwan. If there were to be some kind of like incursion in the next 20 to 30 years, what would the role of air power be? How would you see that playing out?
Air power would be the quickest way to stop it. I don't know which way it would go. This is such a gray area that we can only speculate, to be very honest, on what happens.
And do you, how likely do you feel that there will be some kind of conflict there?
Again, we don't know. And I'm sorry, I'm not chickening out of your question. I really can't answer that because we are assuming that the Chinese will do certain things. Well, what if they don't do them? You see what I'm saying? So it could be a different process. Sam, and then
There was one at the.
oh, sorry.
Yeah,
there's-
yeah.
Oh, you had. I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
apologize. I don't have my glasses. I can't see that far.
After all the horrible things that we saw during the recent wars, makes sense to think about Geneva Conventions when we think about robotics and AI, because we eventually think that we might go through a hybrid phase. Will we copy and paste the nuclear treaties, or it would be a very dangerous thing to watch?
Look, international lawyers are talking about this now. Do you have an international law department at Lancaster?
We have a law department with a good few international lawyers, yeah.
So they're thinking about this right now, because, there are very smart people who are sitting there saying 20 years from now, this is going to be a problem. Before it becomes a problem, let's start looking for solutions. And they're not happy, believe me, because they see the ethical and moral dimensions that you're bringing up. So, you had your hand up, Sam?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Go ahead, yeah. Yeah, sure, yeah.
My question was, I want to get your opinion on this. From what I'm saying, I feel like the main battle tank is becoming like obsolete. If you think about the amount of anti-tank weaponry, what's your opinion on that?
On anti-tank weapons?
No, I'm saying, do you think that the main battle tank, say like a Leopard, Abraham, do you think they become obsolete? Because that's what I feel like. But I want to get your opinion.
Depends in which context you use them. Against a particular kind of enemy, probably not. Against most enemies, yes. So against a China, a main battle tank might run into a lot of trouble. In Iraq, no.
Yeah, so I would like to get your opinion. Do you think there's a point in like countries continuing to invest? My understanding is the UK is developing new main battle tank. Is that correct?
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Harry, do you know?
No,
No.
do you think there's a point in that? Because I understand like battle tanks have their purpose, their place. Like if you're attacking a weaker power and you want to like take land and forcibly, like say you're Russia, go into Crimea, battle tanks have a place. But then in like an all-out war, they're just going to get like blitzed by aircraft and anti-tank weaponry. So I don't know.
I think Europe is backing away from it, if I may put it this way to you. Sure.
About APCs, obviously they have their purpose, not a personal area. I'm just about like traditional tanks with a long cannon.
No, you're talking about main battle tanks, 60-ton things. Here's the deal, very simply. The Germans in the Cold War had 2,000 Leopard tanks. The Germans now have 211. And I asked the German Major General in Washington this question, how many are operational? Which is different from having something. He said 96. So again, if anybody's going to be overrun by tanks, it's the Germans. It's not Britain. It's kind of getting across the channel might be a bit difficult, but they are not putting the money into it. They're looking for other things. And the people who are putting the money into it, I can tell you on the India-China border, the Indians are talking a lot about using air power, using artillery, these kinds of things. The Chinese are talking, I'll finish and I'll take. The Chinese are talking about using rocket guided artillery, guided missiles, guided other weaponry, GPS and drone guided. And they say we can inflict a lot of damage with that. They're not talking air power. They're actually very good at what they want to do. So.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, sorry, you see like when you're talking about the India-China border, it's quite it's like really bad terrain, right? So surely in that situation, like something like tanks doesn't really make sense. Like you need like attack helicopters, which I believe like India is trying to procure more of them, right? Like
they bought a lot of them. They don't work too well in the Himalayas. The Himalayas, the air is thin. Rotors don't spin very efficiently in a thin atmosphere. And it's not an easy place to fight. I've been up to the Himalayas. I've seen the battlegrounds. Most people die in the India-Pakistan one. And we'll talk about the India-China one in a minute. The India-Pakistan, most people die from landslides and pulmonary edemas. That's when the lungs get full of water. And in the India-China one, which happened last year, they had a punch-up. And what happened was they're fighting on a narrow ledge, and people fell off the ledge and died.
Yeah, well, isn't that because they use the riot shields and sticks and bad situation at like the baseball bats with like the nails and stuff because of their like no firearm policy, right? They have, my understanding is they have assault rifles, but they're like without bullets because they don't want to start like all-out war.
I'll answer your question this way. Look at where the Chinese and the Russians are putting their money now. Okay? And it's not what you think.
Sorry, we'll get a response. We need to sort of take
Sam
one
had
more,
a question,
I think.
and then maybe.
I think this is probably the last one. I was being
Okay,
very.
sure.
Yeah, I was going to
James,
ask
yeah.
on the issue of kind of the appetite of, especially publics in the West, to kind of casualties. I think it was 57,000 people, US soldiers died in Vietnam, and the appetite by the end of the war was essentially gone completely. Do you think that a shift towards privatising military forces will occur because of the lack of appetite? You know, instead of making, you know, the incentive being money in that scenario, is that a possibility?
Yeah. It could happen. I mean, we've had mercenaries for decades, centuries, you know. But in real terms, the problem with privatizing it is the code of conduct goes away. And then you can do anything you like. And we find out 5 years later, 10 years later. You've seen what's coming out about Australian forces in Afghanistan. The Australian government and the Australian public are very upset, and rightly so. And they were, you know, this is the kind of restraints that we expect when we send people into war. And the minute you privatize this, you take it away. But there's the other part that Sam, and this is why I'm not in favor of this. Stanley Allen McChrystal, who got fired because he said mean things about Obama and Hillary Clinton, put it really well recently. He said, he was asked, what is the lesson of the Afghan war? And he said, we should make sure that the next time we go to war, somebody from every postal code in America is represented. So everyone has a stake and a skin in the game. I mean, you think about it this way. If a soldier from Lancaster dies in a foreign conflict, the whole town will know. I mean, at 40,000, these things get around very quickly. London, no. But at 40,000, and then it's, you know, it's personal. So it's like the person who cuts your hair may be his aunt. It's that kind of linkage. And this is what McChrystal is talking about. He's saying if you have everybody from every postal code in a country going in, you will be very careful about how you use your forces. And privatized forces, they worry me, because everything which we expect of soldiers, we are not asking mercenaries to do. And that's shameful, quite frankly. This gets back to her question. There's a reason we have a Geneva Convention. You know? So, did you have a last question, Michael? No.
No, can I just actually go back to your at the heart of your argument is really what you might call demographic.
Yeah, destiny.
And I suppose what I was interested in is actually, that's the big picture, and I agree, that the devil's in the detail. And I jotted a couple down in my note. One is guns v. butter. Guns can win votes. I mean, I'm a Russian specialist, I used to go to Texas. These are two settings where that kind of nationalist rhetoric can win very strongly.
Sure.
And then the other is actually about countries that are on decline demographically can play the game through immigration, importing skills, etc. Now, actually, this isn't to disagree with the set picture you're setting out, but is the interesting thing actually how different countries might respond to this and find new ways of defending and asserting their power, even in this big context?
Sure. I'll put it this way. Guns do win votes because we all, like I said, you show a politician fighter jets taking off of an aircraft carrier, it's sexy as hell. You know, there's no doubt about it. Does it achieve anything? That's a different story. In real terms, though, I'll say this. I think countries are going to find other ways to exercise power because of this. And on the immigration thing, look, the Germans are letting in people. The Canadians bring in 400,000 people a year, by the way, now, because there's this cohort of old Canadians. I should have shown that slide to you. So anybody who's young, welcome to Canada. That's their new goal, because somebody your age is not going to take Social Security for 40 years, which means you're paying into it for 40 years. So they are doing that. The problem is attracting migrants is not as easy as people think it is, because if you are going as a migrant somewhere, you want to go as a stakeholder. And some countries say come in as a guest worker. Remember the Turks going to Germany? That never worked out well. Half the Turkish football team is born in Germany. Why does it play for Turkey? That's the question to ask, you know. So I think that part is that the Swedes bring in people, their population isn't going up, and everybody tries to get their people to have more sex. You know, Denmark had a national sex week. I'll tell you guys this, you'll die laughing. Anybody Danish here? No. Okay. The Danes had a national sex week, and they said, go home and procreate. Okay. Nobody did. They all watched the European Championship and drank Carlsberg, which was the right thing to do. And Denmark, by the way, is a good football team. Let's not make any bones about that. Father Putin asked Russian women to do their patriotic duty. And Russian women said, I don't think so. It's in Japan, they keep trying to do it. And Japanese women have said, no, we've opted out of this. Korean women have opted out. Taiwanese women have opted out. And I'll say one thing here, and this is to the women in the class. The future is female. I'm sorry. And yes, I see all these skulls from the young men in the audience, but tough. I want you to understand this. 3 of the most impressive women in the world today are Malala, who took a bullet in the head and just got a PhD from Oxford, correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Who talks about global women's rights for education. Greta Thunberg, okay, who at 16 or 15 or 14 got 4 million children around the world to walk out of class for climate change. Now, I think that is a bit exaggerated, because if I was given the option to walk out of class at 14, I would have been gone in a flash. You know? And yes, I'm for climate survival. And you look at people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. You look at look at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who did such a phenomenal thing when 50 people got killed in that mosque. You know, she led from the front and got rid of assault weapons in New Zealand in a week. She said, the Australians did it in 12 days, we'll do it in 10. She did it in 7. So my point to you is, I think we're headed to a different world. And it's going to come, and I will say this to the women in the class, be prepared for a struggle over the next 10 years. Because as you come forward with your ideas and your thinking, you will be challenged. And I'll end with saying this. I have 2 nieces, I call them my nieces, because I'm very close to their mother. And they say, you're our favorite uncle. Their mother says, you're their only uncle. You know? And I'm like, we're being picky here, but I'll go with the favorite part in it. So I told them, I said, I have the money, you have the ideas. And you have 50 more years than I do on this planet. And I'll get to the 50 in a second. Where do you want me to put the money to make the world a better place for you? So I got a list. The list was the Committee to Protect Journalists, PETA. You know, that's the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They don't like me because I eat meat. The ACLU, Planned Parenthood. And then this weird one, which was the Society to Preserve Hedgehogs. And I was like, why would anybody want to preserve hedgehogs? But it seems they're cute creatures. This is what's coming, Michael. And keep this in mind. Greta Thunberg is 18 or 19 now. Swedes live to be 85. So add 75 years to 65 years to Greta Thunberg's life, she's going to live to 2085. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will live till 2055. Malala will live till 2070. Where is the great force that is going to stop these people who are in their 20s now? And the answer is no. They're all 70, 80-year-old politicians trying to bring the wheel of time back. And if you're a 70-year-old politician today, you would have to be 145 years old when Greta Thunberg dies. Now, do you know any 145-year-old people? I don't. See, this is the reality. I think we are still thinking security in terms of guns, tanks, bureaucratic politics, so on. We have to see where the world is headed. And you know this since you were a dean here, so you've seen the admissions numbers. In the United States now, it's 3:2, women to men in colleges. I don't know what it is at Lancaster. Not far off, yeah. And this is the future. Even in engineering and mathematics and so on, it's gone up to somewhere between 25 to 45%. So if these are going to be the new leaders, it's worth asking, what do you want in the world? So I'm an idealist. I'm not militaristic. I believe in national security, and the future is female, as I have said. So be prepared to fight for your rights. Okay.
Thanks, Amit. I think touching on Danish Sex Week is a good way to indicate what a holistic approach you've taken to security and the challenges for global air forces. But in all seriousness, that is absolutely fascinating talk and a way to come at the subject. And I can tell how much that's stimulated thought in the room and indeed for the audience online. Probably the sanest and most realistic analysis of the subject I've ever heard, says John
I like
Usher.
it.
So you can take that one for your quotation.
That's very nice.
Thank you ever so much to everybody for tuning in online and for your questions. Apologies if there was those I didn't get to, and thank you to everyone for coming out this evening and for your questions as well. So again, just if you would like to come to future events, check out our website for Centre War and Diplomacy, the podcast as well. The RAF Museum, I think, regularly streams events, so do have a look at those as well. That's it. That's the website right there. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And by all means, visit the RAF Museum as well when you're in the area. So all that remains, just ask you one final time to show your thanks to our guests tonight. Amit Gupta.